I never thought a simple garden could cause so much chaos in a neighborhood. To me, it wasn't just a patch of dirt with vegetables and flowers. It was therapy, peace, and something I poured my heart into after long days of work. But apparently, to the HOA, it was an unauthorized landscaping project. I'll never forget the day I got the letter, bold red print across the top, threatening me with daily fines if I didn't remove my plants. I stood there in my kitchen, letter trembling in my hands, wondering how something so small and harmless could turn into such a battle. That was the moment I realized, maybe it wasn't just about my garden. Maybe this was bigger. When I called the HOA to ask why my little garden was such a problem, the woman on the phone barely let me finish my sentence. "It violates uniformity standards," she snapped, as if reading from a script. I asked, "Uniformity? You mean you want every yard to look exactly the same? No flowers, no vegetables, no life?" Her tone didn't change. "Correct. Your property must comply, or fines will be enforced." I hung up the phone feeling both angry and helpless. It was ridiculous. How could they tell me what I could grow on my own land? That night, as I watered my tomatoes and watched the sun set behind my fence, I knew I couldn't just roll over and let them win. The next morning, I went for a walk around the block. That's when I realized something interesting. I wasn't the only one frustrated. My neighbor Sarah had been told to take down her birdhouse because it wasn't HOA approved. The Johnsons got cited for having a swing set that was supposedly the wrong color. Everywhere I looked, people were quietly complying, afraid of fines, but secretly angry. When I brought up my garden, their eyes lit up. "I wish we could do something," Sarah whispered, almost like the HOA had spies listening. That was the first spark of an idea. What if my garden wasn't just mine? What if it became something for all of us? I stayed up late that night sketching out ideas. A community garden, shared space, shared work, shared harvest. If the HOA wanted to label my garden a violation, fine. But what if dozens of neighbors came together? Would they fine all of us? Would they fight against a project that brought the entire neighborhood together? By morning, I was convinced. I typed up a flyer with the bold words, "Let's build a community garden," and slipped copies into mailboxes up and down the street. My hand shook a little with nerves, but deep down, I felt excitement building. This wasn't just about tomatoes anymore. This was about standing up to the ridiculous control the HOA tried to force on us. A week later, I hosted the first garden meeting in my backyard. Honestly, I expected maybe 5 people to show up. But by 6 o'clock, nearly 20 neighbors had gathered, carrying lawn chairs, notebooks, and even snacks. We talked about what we could plant, where we could build, and how we could organize. Someone joked that the HOA would probably show up with measuring tape to see if the carrots were the right length. Laughter filled the yard, and for the first time, we felt united. There was a quiet rebellion in the air, not just against the HOA, but against the idea that we couldn't shape our own community. Of course, it didn't take long for the HOA to catch wind of our plans. 2 days later, I got another letter, this one practically dripping with condescension. They claimed our proposed community garden was unauthorized, unsanctioned, and subject to immediate rejection. But instead of backing down, I posted the letter in our neighborhood group chat. People were furious. "Who do they think they are?" One neighbor wrote. "It's our neighborhood, not their kingdom." Suddenly, what started as my little fight turned into a neighborhood-wide movement. On Saturday morning, we gathered at the empty lot at the edge of the neighborhood, a patch of land that had been unused for years. Shovels, seeds, gloves, and determination filled the air. Kids painted signs, parents dug rows, and older neighbors shared gardening wisdom. By the end of the day, rows of soil were ready, and little green sprouts peeked out of the ground. Standing there, sweaty and tired, I realized something powerful. The HOA couldn't stop this. They could send letters, threats, even fines, but they couldn't erase what we had built together. This wasn't just a garden. It was a symbol of freedom. Sure enough, the HOA escalated. They sent inspectors to take photos, tried to call emergency meetings, and even threatened to tow cars parked near the lot. But here's the thing. Every time they tried to tear us down, more neighbors joined in. People who had never spoken before were suddenly bringing snacks for volunteers, lending tools, and offering to cover fines if needed. The harder the HOA pushed, the stronger we grew. The garden wasn't just plants in the soil. It was roots of community, spreading deeper with every act of resistance. Word spread beyond our neighborhood. A local reporter showed up, curious about the garden rebellion. She interviewed me, Sarah, and a few others, and the story aired on the evening news. Suddenly, the HOA wasn't just fighting us, they were fighting public opinion. Strangers from nearby neighborhoods came to see our garden. Some brought seeds, others brought flowers, and a few just came to cheer us on. We had started a revolution with tomatoes and cucumbers, and the HOA couldn't hide from it anymore. The HOA called a meeting, this time open to all residents. The board members sat at the front of the room, stiff and defensive, while dozens of us filled every chair. I stood up and spoke. This isn't about breaking rules. This is about community, about bringing people together, about turning empty land into something beautiful. Applause erupted. For the first time, the board looked nervous. One by one, neighbors stood to speak. By the end, it was clear the HOA had lost the room. The next week, the HOA quietly backed down. They didn't apologize, of course. They just decided not to pursue enforcement at this time. But we didn't care. The garden thrived. Sunflowers stretched toward the sky. Kids picked strawberries straight from the vine, and neighbors shared zucchini like currency. It wasn't perfect, gardening never is, but it was ours. Every time I walked past those rows, I smiled, knowing this was living proof that sometimes the best way to fight control is to grow something stronger. These days, I still tend to my own little plot, but the community garden has become something far bigger than me. It's where neighbors meet, where kids learn, where friendships grow alongside the vegetables. The HOA still exists, sure, but their power? It's weaker now. People aren't afraid anymore. And me? I'm proud. Proud that I didn't just cave in when they tried to find me. Proud that we built something lasting. And every time I see someone smiling with a basket full of fresh produce, I think back to that first threatening letter, and I laugh. Because the thing they tried to destroy, it's now the heart of our neighborhood. Even after the HOA backed down publicly, they didn't disappear. They lingered, watching from the sidelines, taking notes, snapping photos, whenever they thought no one noticed. I'd catch one of the board members, parked across from the garden, window half rolled down, scribbling something on a clipboard. My neighbors saw it too. They're waiting for us to slip up, Sarah whispered one evening as we watered the rows. It was like a cat-and-mouse game, except this time, the mice weren't running. We were standing tall, daring them to make their move. The next tactic was subtler. Suddenly, the water access near the community lot was restricted for maintenance. Then, a letter appeared claiming our garden soil could attract pests and lower property values. They even tried spreading rumors that the vegetables were unsafe to eat because we didn't have proper permits. At first, these things shook us. I remember sitting on my porch late one night, wondering if we'd made a mistake. But the very next morning, Mr. Patel, our elderly neighbor, marched into the garden carrying a bucket of water from his own home. "If they cut the water, we'll bring it ourselves," he said proudly. That single act sparked something. Soon, everyone was hauling buckets, watering cans, even kids with toy pails filled to the brim. The garden lived, no matter what tricks the HOA tried. The stronger the opposition became, the closer we grew as neighbors. People who had lived side by side for years, but barely spoke, were now laughing together as they pulled weeds or shared recipes under the shade of sunflowers. The Johnson kids made a wooden sign that read "Our Garden, Our Rules," and stuck it in the soil. Someone else brought an old bench, and it became the place where stories were shared late into the night. Every time the HOA tried to weaken us, they only strengthened what they feared most: unity. But then disaster struck. One summer night, a violent storm rolled in. Winds tore through the neighborhood, rain flooded the streets, and when morning came, the garden was in ruins. Plants were uprooted, trellises splintered, signs toppled, and mud swallowed whole rows of vegetables. I stood there in shock, my heart sinking. The board members didn't hide their smirks as they drove by slowly that morning. One even said under his breath, "Guess nature did the work for us." For the first time, I felt crushed. Maybe they were right. Maybe this was the end. But the very next day, something incredible happened. One by one, neighbors showed up, rain boots, gloves, shovels in hand. No one asked, no one organized. They just came. Kids picked up fallen stakes, teenagers hauled wheelbarrows, and the elderly sat in chairs directing where new rows should go. By noon, laughter filled the air again, louder than the sound of hammering and digging. "They thought this storm would end us," Sarah said, wiping dirt from her face. "But all it did was show how strong we are." By the end of the week, the garden was back, bigger, brighter, and stronger than before. That's when the HOA tried their boldest move yet. They called in lawyers. A thick packet arrived in my mailbox, pages of legal jargon claiming the community garden violated zoning ordinances, safety standards, and half a dozen other rules no one had ever heard of. They demanded the garden be dismantled within 30 days. Fear rippled through us. Not everyone could afford a legal battle. Some neighbors worried about being dragged into court. For a moment, doubt crept in. But then something unexpected happened. A local law firm, inspired by the news coverage of our fight, offered to represent us pro bono. Suddenly, we weren't alone. We had professionals standing beside us, ready to face the HOA on their own battlefield. The day of the hearing felt surreal. We packed a small courtroom, neighbors filling every bench, while the HOA board sat stiffly with their expensive suits and thick binders. Their lawyer droned on about property values and uniform aesthetics, painting our garden as a dangerous, reckless project. Then our attorney stood and said simply, "This garden has brought nothing but good. It has united families, reduced crime by keeping the lot active, and provided food for those who need it. How is that a violation? Isn't that the definition of community?" He called witnesses, neighbors who spoke passionately, even kids who held up drawings of their favorite flowers. By the end, the judge leaned back, sighed, and ruled in our favor. The HOA had no grounds. The garden was here to stay. That fall, we held our first official harvest festival. Long tables covered with baskets of fresh produce lined the garden. Kids ran around with painted faces, neighbors shared homemade pies, and music floated through the crisp evening air. As I looked around, I realized the garden had become more than I ever dreamed. It wasn't just vegetables in the ground. It was friendships, resilience, and proof that ordinary people could stand up to power and win. The HOA still exists, sure, but their authority has crumbled. They no longer dictate, they negotiate. And me, I walked through the rows of blooming sunflowers, smiling, knowing that a single threatening fine turned into a legacy. We didn't just plant seeds in the soil. We planted them in each other's hearts. And that's a harvest no HOA can ever take away. Months later, the garden became more than a local project. It became a model. Other neighborhoods, inspired by what we had done, started reaching out. They wanted to know how to organize, how to stand up to restrictive HOAs, how to turn empty land into something alive. We shared seeds, stories, and encouragement. What started as one person refusing to back down had spread beyond our block, beyond our town. And every time I saw a new community garden spring up, I knew the fight had been worth every letter, every threat, every sleepless night. One evening, I walked through the garden alone, the setting sun painting everything in gold. I knelt by the same patch where I had once planted my first tomato, the same one the HOA tried to erase. I thought about the fear I had felt that day, holding their fine notice in my hands, thinking I was powerless. And now, that patch was surrounded by thriving plants, buzzing bees, and laughter echoing from the picnic tables. I realized this wasn't just about a garden anymore. It was about finding my voice and giving others the courage to use theirs too. The HOA is still around, but they're different now. They know they can't bully or control the way they once did, because we learned something powerful. They only had as much authority as we gave them. And once we stopped being afraid, they stopped being strong. The community garden still blooms season after season. New families join in. Kids grow up learning how to plant and harvest, and neighbors who once walked past each other in silence now share meals, laughter, and stories. When I stand there, surrounded by sunflowers taller than me, I remember the first letter they sent, the one meant to scare me into silence. Instead, it planted something far greater. We didn't just grow food here. We grew courage. We grew unity. We grew freedom. And that's a harvest no HOA can ever find away. Over time, the garden became more than just ours. It became a legacy. Parents brought their children not just to water plants, but to teach them lessons about standing up for what's right. This row of beans, one father told his son, only exists because people refuse to give up. The garden turned into a living classroom, where seeds weren't just planted in the soil, but in young minds, seeds of resilience, community, and hope. Even some of the board members who once fought us began to change. A year later, one of them, Mr. Lewis, who had signed the very first violation letter, showed up with a tray of seedlings. He didn't say much, just placed them down and started planting beside us. No one mocked him, no one scolded him. We just let him dig. In that quiet moment, I realized the garden hadn't just transformed our community. It had healed it. It had turned enemies into neighbors again. Looking back now, I understand something I never truly grasped at the beginning. This fight was never just about tomatoes, cucumbers, or sunflowers. It wasn't about the neat rows of plants or the colors of blossoms pushing through the soil. It was about something deeper, something invisible that took root the moment we decided not to back down. It was about freedom, the freedom to shape our own spaces, to create beauty where there had once been emptiness, and to say no when someone tried to control us for the sake of power. That little patch of green soil, once dismissed as a violation, became a living symbol of resilience. It showed us that we didn't need permission to come together, to build something meaningful, to fight for joy in a world that often tries to strip it away. What we grew here wasn't just food, it was courage. It was unity. It was proof that ordinary people, standing side by side, can become extraordinary when they refuse to be silenced. One day, yes, the sunflowers will bend and wither, their golden heads bowing back into the soil. The vegetables will have their seasons, and the soil will rest until new hands return to work it. But when that day comes, it won't be the end. It will be a continuation. Because the story of this garden isn't written only in rows of corn or baskets of zucchini. It's written in the laughter of children running between rows, in the calloused hands of neighbors sharing tools, in the quiet forgiveness of former rivals planting seeds side by side. And long after the last bloom fades, new families, new dreamers will carry on the work. They'll plant, they'll water, and they'll remember the truth we proved here. You can threaten with fines. You can send letters and lawyers. You can try to control with fear. But you can never stop a community that has found its voice. You can't silence people who choose to grow together. You can't bury a legacy that's rooted in freedom. And that, more than anything else, is the harvest we'll always carry with us.